He invited her to watch him marry someone else. He chose the date. He chose the venue. He chose the seat she would occupy, somewhere in the middle of the room, close enough to see everything, far enough to matter to no one. He had planned every detail of that afternoon with the precision of a man who had spent 2 years convincing himself that what he had done was not cruelty. It was simply correction. She had been a mistake. The wedding was the proof that he had moved past it. What he had not planned was the envelope. What he had not planned was the woman she had become in the time he had spent forgetting her. And what he had not planned, not even in his most careful, most controlled, most private calculations, was that the very document he believed buried would surface in that chapel in the hands of a notary, in front of every person whose opinion he had ever valued. He thought he was ending a chapter. She had come to close the entire book, on her own terms, in her own time, with evidence he could not argue against, and a composure he could not shake. This is the story of Maren Ashby, the woman a duke tried to erase, and the afternoon she made that impossible. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with black wax and stamped with the Cravenshaw crest. Maren recognized it immediately, not because she had missed it, but because she had spent 2 years learning to forget what that seal once meant to her. She set it on the table without opening it, made her tea, and stood by the window for a long moment, before finally sliding the letter open with steady hands. The words were formal, elegant, and perfectly cruel. Lord Dorian Velthorpe, Duke of Cravenshaw, requested the honor of her presence at his wedding to Miss Isolde Price, to be held at Velthorpe Hall on the 14th of October. There was no personal note, no explanation, just the invitation, as if she were any other name on a list, as if everything that had passed between them had been nothing more than a footnote he had already closed. But Maren had learned, in the hardest way possible, that men like Dorian never did anything without intention. The invitation was not courtesy. It was a declaration. He wanted her there, seated among the guests, watching him choose someone else, watching him prove, once and for all, that she had never mattered. What he did not know was that she had already decided to come, and that she would not be arriving empty-handed. If you already understand that this story is not about a woman who was broken, but about a woman who was building, then stay with us, because what Maren carries into that chapel will change everything you think you know about this duke, this wedding, and the document no one saw coming. Subscribe to the channel and make sure you don't miss a single scene. 2 years ago, Maren Ashby had been the kind of woman people noticed, not for her fortune because she had very little, but for the quiet certainty with which she moved through rooms that were not built for people like her. She had grown up on the edges of aristocratic society, close enough to understand its rules and far enough to never fully belong. When Dorian had chosen her, spoken his vows in a private ceremony, witnessed by no one but the law and the cold stone walls of a country chapel, she had believed, for the first time, that belonging was something she might actually touch. Then came the accusation. Then came the silence. Then came the morning he looked at her across the breakfast table as if she were a mistake in need of correcting, and told her, in the same measured voice he used to address his solicitors, that she was no longer welcome in his life. She had not screamed. She had not begged. She had walked out of Velthorpe Hall with one bag and the kind of stillness that only settles over a person after something inside them has already broken beyond the reach of witnesses. Society forgot her quickly, as it always forgets women who vanish without a public spectacle. But Maren had not disappeared to hide. She had disappeared to rebuild, slowly, deliberately, in the quiet that no one was watching, until she was something Dorian would not recognize, until she was ready. And on the morning his invitation arrived, she stood before her mirror and understood that every month of silence had not been surrender. It had been strategy. She arrived exactly 12 minutes after the ceremony was scheduled to begin, late enough to be noticed, early enough to still have a seat. The footman at the entrance hesitated when he found her name on the list, glancing once at her face and once at the card in his hand, as if the two could not possibly belong together. Maren simply waited, unhurried, until he stepped aside. She walked in without searching for reactions. She did not need to look. She could feel the room shift the moment she crossed the threshold. She had chosen her gown with the same precision she had applied to everything else over the past 2 years. Deep slate gray, perfectly fitted, unadorned, except for a single pearl at her throat. Nothing designed to demand attention, everything built to hold it. Her hair was pinned simply, the way she had worn it before she learned that simplicity, in a room full of jewels, is its own kind of power. She moved toward an open seat near the center aisle, settled herself with perfect composure, and folded her gloved hands in her lap as if she had all the time in the world. Around her, whispers gathered like weather. Soft at first, then urgent, then impossible to contain. Women leaned toward each other behind their programs. Men who had once looked through her suddenly remembered her name. But none of that was what mattered. What mattered was the single instant when a pair of shoulders she had once known by heart, 3 rows ahead, went completely and unnaturally still. Dorian had heard the whispers, too, and for the first time since sealing that invitation with his crest, she suspected he was beginning to understand his mistake. Isolde Price was everything the Tun had expected Dorian to choose, and she carried that expectation like a second gown. She stood at the front of the chapel with the practiced composure of a woman prepared for exactly this moment from girlhood, her dress an immaculate construction of ivory silk and Flemish lace, her posture irreproachable, her expression calibrated to suggest joy without vulnerability. She was beautiful in the way that things designed for public admiration are beautiful, flawless, deliberate, and carefully kept at a distance. Dorian stood beside her with the unhurried ease of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. He was every measure the Duke of Cravenshaw, broad-shouldered, controlled, dressed in charcoal wool that caught the candlelight along every precise line. He had built this wedding the same way he built everything in his life, with method, with authority, and with the particular confidence of someone who had long since stopped expecting to be surprised. He had designed the guest list. He had reviewed every arrangement. He had even accounted for Maren, her presence, her grief, her silent testimony to everything he had moved past. What he had not accounted for was the quality of the silence that had fallen over the room. He recognized whispers. He had lived among them his entire life. But these carried a different weight. Not the warm admiration of a celebrated ceremony, but the charged, breathless tension of a crowd that has caught the scent of something unplanned. Dorian did not turn around. A duke did not turn around at his own wedding. But the muscle along his jaw tightened once, and beside him Isolde's perfect smile wavered for just a fraction of a second before she pulled it back into place. The moment arrived during the pause before the officiant spoke. That brief, suspended stillness when the room settles and everyone faces forward. Dorian turned, only slightly, only enough to confirm what every instinct in his body had already announced, and found her at once, as if the room had quietly arranged itself to make her visible. Maren sat 7 rows back on the left side of the aisle, and she was already looking directly at him. He had rehearsed this confrontation without meaning to, in the margins of long evenings, in the silence between appointments. And in every version he had constructed, she looked reduced, worn down by the years, diminished by the distance, carrying in her expression the unmistakable weight of a woman who had been shown her limits. He had built that image carefully because it was simpler than its opposite. The woman watching him now was nothing like that image. She looked composed, she looked unhurried, and she did not look away. It lasted no more than a few seconds before Dorian returned his gaze to the altar. But something had already shifted, not in the room, not in the ceremony, but in the careful internal structure he had assembled to make this day feel like a conclusion. There was nothing wounded in the way Maren had looked at him. No grief, no appeal, no silent request for him to acknowledge what he had cost her. That absence, that complete undisturbed self-possession, told him, with a clarity he had not invited, that he had made an error in judgment. He simply did not yet understand the full size of it. The ceremony had not yet reached its vows. Dorian was still standing at that altar, still believing he had the afternoon under control, still telling himself that her presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a last desperate attempt by a woman he had discarded to feel relevant to a story that had moved on without her. He was wrong about all of it, because what Maren had brought into that chapel was not grief. It was not pride. It was not even the quiet satisfaction of a woman watching the man who hurt her face a room full of witnesses. It was a document, 3 pages, signed, registered, and entirely, irrefutably legal. And before that ceremony reached its end, every person in that room would understand exactly what it meant, including the woman standing at the altar in ivory silk, who had no idea she was not the only one with a claim to that name. Stay with us. The moment that stopped the wedding is coming, and nothing will be the same after it. The ceremony had not yet reached its second prayer, when the murmurs became impossible to ignore. It began, as these things always do in aristocratic gatherings, with the women nearest the back. A glance exchanged over a fan, a name spoken behind a gloved hand, a question passed along the pew like a flame finding dry paper. Who is she? Why is she here? Did he invite her personally? The questions moved faster than the answers, which was precisely how rumor preferred to travel. Those who had been present in society long enough to remember pieced it together quickly. Maren Ashby. The name surfaced in hushed tones, carrying with it the vague but persistent memory of a woman who had appeared briefly in Dorian Velthorpe's orbit 2 years prior, and then vanished without explanation. At the time, no one had asked too many questions. A duke's private affairs were his own, and a woman without title or fortune disappearing from his life was hardly the kind of story that demanded investigation. But her reappearance now, at his wedding, changed the texture of that old silence considerably. What unsettled the room most was not that she had come. It was how she had come. There was no performance of distress, no visible attempt to be noticed, no trace of the desperation that the situation seemed to demand. Maren sat with her hands folded and her gaze forward, as composed as any invited guest with nothing to prove. And that composure, that utter, unshakable stillness in a room full of people waiting for her to crack, was the most unsettling thing anyone in Velthorpe Hall had witnessed in a very long time. What the guests did not know, what society had never been given reason to examine, was that Maren and Dorian's history did not begin with a courtship. It began with a chapel, a small, unremarkable stone building on the northern edge of his estate, attended by no family, no guests, no fanfare of any kind. Just the two of them, a country officiant, and a register that Dorian had been absolutely certain would never surface again. He had told himself at the time that the marriage had been an impulse, the kind of reckless private decision that a man of his position could quietly correct before it became a complication. He had been wrong about Maren from the beginning, he reasoned afterward. She had seemed different from the women who surrounded him, unbothered by performance, disinterested in his title in a way that he had mistaken for depth. It had taken him less than a year to decide that her simplicity was not strength, it was limitation. And so he had done what men of his world did when they made inconvenient choices. He had constructed a reason to end it, delivered it without ceremony, and expected her to disappear the way quiet women always did. What he had never considered was that Maren had understood exactly what he was doing. She had seen the calculation behind the accusation, recognized the coldness of a man covering his tracks rather than speaking a genuine grievance. She had left not because she believed his version of events, but because she had realized, standing in that hallway with her bag in her hand, that fighting him on his own ground with none of his resources would cost her everything she had left. So she had left with one thing he did not know she was taking, the proof that the marriage had never been dissolved. Mr. Aldrich Fenn had attended the wedding in his professional capacity, as he attended most significant events among the Cravenshaw circle, quietly, observantly, and with the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent 30 years ensuring that other people's legal affairs did not become his personal concern. He had taken his seat near the end of the third row, accepted a program from the footman, and settled in with every expectation of an uneventful afternoon. The envelope reached him during the second hymn, passed along the pew by a hand he did not immediately recognize. It was white, unsealed, and bore his full name in a handwriting he did not know. He might have set it aside until after the ceremony, propriety suggested as much. But something in the weight of it, something in the precise and deliberate way it had been addressed, made him open it then and there, shielding the contents behind his program with the discretion of long professional habit. He read it once, then he read it again. The color left his face in the way that color leaves a room when a candle is extinguished, not dramatically but completely. His hands did not shake because Aldrich Fenn was not a man given to visible reactions. But the program lowered slowly to his lap, and for a long moment he sat perfectly still, staring at the document in his hands, with the expression of a man who has just understood that the event he is attending is not, in any legal sense, permitted to proceed. The officiant had just reached the words that precede the formal exchange of vows, that measured, solemn passage that signals to every witness in the room that the moment of no return is approaching. When Mr. Aldrich Fenn rose from his seat, he did not raise his voice. He did not make a gesture designed for drama. He simply stood, straightened his coat, and said in the clear and unhurried tone of a man fulfilling a professional obligation that he regretted the interruption, but that there was a legal matter requiring immediate attention before the ceremony could continue. The room did not erupt, it contracted. Every person present seemed to draw breath simultaneously and hold it, turning toward the aisle with the collective stillness of people who understand, instinctively, that something has just changed the shape of the afternoon. Isolde's hands tightened around her bouquet. The officiant looked from Mr. Fenn to the Duke with the bewildered expression of a man whose script had just been removed from his hands mid-performance. Dorian did not move. He stood at the altar with his jaw set and his eyes forward, as if the force of his stillness alone could prevent whatever was coming from arriving. But it arrived anyway. Mr. Fenn walked to the front of the chapel with measured steps, presented the document to the officiant with both hands, and waited while the older man read it. The silence in the room was the kind that has texture, thick, breathless, impossible to speak through. And then the officiant looked up from the page, looked at Dorian, looked at Isolde, and in the careful voice of someone choosing every word with the precision of a man who understands the weight of what he is about to say, announced that the ceremony could not lawfully proceed. The document was 3 pages long, written in the formal language of legal record, and it contained one fact that made every other detail of the afternoon irrelevant. Maren Ashby and Dorian Velthorpe, Duke of Cravenshaw, had been lawfully married on the 9th of March, 2 years and 7 months prior, in the parish of St. Olave's on the northern boundary of the Cravenshaw estate. The marriage had been properly registered. It had never been annulled. It had never been dissolved by any court or ecclesiastical authority. It was, in every sense that the law recognized, still in effect. The name Maren Ashby, lawful wife of the Duke of Cravenshaw, moved through the room in the way that a stone moves through still water. People did not speak it aloud, not immediately. They absorbed it first each person recalibrating everything they thought they had understood about the man standing at the altar, about the woman seated 7 rows back, about the wedding they had dressed carefully to attend. The arithmetic of the situation arranged itself with brutal clarity. Dorian had known. He had known when he planned the wedding, when he invited the guests, when he sent that envelope sealed with his crest to the woman the law still recognized as his wife. Maren did not stand. She did not speak. She sat exactly where she had been sitting since she arrived, with her gloved hands in her lap and her expression unchanged, and let the room do what rooms do when the truth finally enters, uninvited. Around her, the whispers had stopped entirely, replaced by something heavier and more permanent than gossip. This was no longer a story about a woman who had once been connected to a powerful man. This was a story about a powerful man who had built his most public moment on a foundation he believed no one would ever examine. And the foundation had just given way. The wedding was over before it had finished beginning. The guests were still in their seats. The candles were still burning. Isolde's bouquet was still in her hands. But everything that had been true when they walked through those doors that morning was now irrevocably something else. Dorian Velthorpe, the man who had built his entire life on the architecture of control, was standing at his own altar with nowhere left to stand that did not belong to a story he had tried to erase. And Maren had not moved, had not spoken, had not needed to do anything at all except exist, fully and undeniably, in the room he had invited her into. But here is what no one in that chapel knew yet, not the guests, not Isolde, not even Dorian himself. The document was not the end of what Maren had brought with her that afternoon. It was only the first part. What comes next will show you exactly what 2 years of silence can build, and exactly what a man loses when he mistakes a quiet woman for a defeated one. Isolde had always been perceptive. It was one of the qualities her mother had carefully cultivated in her, alongside posture and French and the precise social smile that communicated warmth without vulnerability. She had applied that perceptiveness to Dorian during their courtship, and had found nothing that alarmed her. He was measured, yes, reserved certainly, but she had interpreted his emotional distance as the dignified restraint of a man of serious character, and she had told herself that warmth would come with time, as it did in all properly arranged unions. Standing at the altar with her bouquet beginning to tremble in her hands, Isolde understood with the particular clarity that arrives only when self-deception finally exhausts itself that she had not been perceptive at all. She had been convenient. Dorian had not chosen her because he admired her, or because he had any intention of building something genuine with her. He had chosen her because she was socially impeccable, because her family asked no difficult questions, and because her presence at his side would make the performance of his life look exactly as it was supposed to look. She had been selected the way one selects furniture, for fit, for appearance, for the way she would reflect well on the room. She turned to look at him then, not with the expression of a woman scorned, but with something quieter and more devastating than that. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have just recognized as false after a long period of genuine belief. Dorian did not meet her eyes. He was staring straight ahead, and the set of his jaw told her everything she needed to know about whether he intended to explain himself. Isolde set her bouquet down on the altar step with a composure that the room would speak about for years, smoothed the front of her gown with both hands, and walked back down the aisle without a single word. They met in the side corridor off the chapel, a narrow stone-floored passage that servants used between ceremonies, lit by a single high window that offered gray afternoon light, and nothing warmer. Dorian had followed Maren there, not because she had asked him to, but because he had run out of places to stand that did not feel like exposure. The room behind them was still rearranging itself around the revelation, and he could not remain in the middle of it without becoming something he had spent his entire adult life refusing to be, a man visibly losing his footing. Maren was standing near the far wall when he entered, her back not quite turned to him, her gloved hands loose at her sides. She did not startle at the sound of his footsteps. She did not turn immediately. When she did face him, her expression held none of the things he had steeled himself against, no anger sharp enough to wound, no grief designed to make him feel its weight, no quiet plea dressed as dignity. She simply looked at him with the calm of someone who had already finished the conversation he was only now beginning. He had prepared words, several versions of them, in fact, arranged in order of usefulness, depending on what he found when he faced her. They dissolved completely the moment she looked at him. What remained was something he had very little practice managing, the unstructured, exposed sensation of standing in front of someone who knows precisely who you are and has decided, with full information, that you are not worth the effort of pretending otherwise. He had come into that corridor expecting to find a woman he could still manage. He found instead someone who had simply stopped being manageable, and had done so long before today. She spoke first, which surprised him. He had expected silence, the weaponized kind, the sort that forces the other person to fill it with confessions or justifications. Instead, Maren's voice came out even and unhurried, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else, someone she had known well and felt clearly for, but from whom she now stood at a useful distance. She told him what she had discovered in the weeks before he ended their marriage, the conversations she had overheard between his solicitor and his secretary, the references to a settlement, to a formal dissolution, to a woman who would be compensated for her inconvenience and expected to make no difficulty. She told him she had understood immediately that the accusation he leveled at her had not been a genuine grievance. It had been a mechanism, a constructed reason designed to make her departure look like his decision rather than his calculation. And she told him that she had chosen to leave before he could execute that plan, not because she was afraid of him, but because she refused to be processed. She refused to be handled. What she did not tell him, what she kept in the quieter part of herself, still protected, was how long it had taken her to stop grieving the man she had believed he was. The man who had stood in that small stone chapel and spoken his vows with something that had looked, in the candlelight, very much like sincerity. She had mourned that man for the better part of a year before she had accepted that he had never fully existed outside of her own willingness to believe in him. And once she had accepted that, she had been able to get to work. By the following morning, the story had traveled the full length of London's social architecture, from the drawing rooms of Mayfair to the clubs on St. James's Street, from the letters exchanged between country houses to the columns of at least 2 publications that traded in the misfortunes of the notable. The details shifted slightly in each retelling, as details always do, but the essential structure remained intact and damning. The Duke of Cravenshaw had attempted to remarry while his legal wife was still living, had invited that wife to witness the ceremony, and had been stopped by the very document he had believed buried beyond recovery. Dorian's allies did not abandon him loudly. Men of that world rarely made their withdrawals dramatic. Drama was for women and theaters, and the truly powerful expressed their disapproval through absence rather than declaration. Invitations that had previously arrived without question did not arrive. Conversations that had previously included him grew shorter, then stopped. His solicitor sent a letter requesting clarification on several matters that had previously required no clarification at all. The machinery of his social world, which had always operated smoothly in his favor, began to develop the particular friction that only appears when the people operating it have quietly decided to let it run down. What struck those who observed him in those first days was not distress. Dorian Velthorpe was not a man who displayed distress, but something more unusual. He appeared for the first time in living memory, uncertain, not of his title, not of his finances, not of the legal situation, which his team of solicitors was already working to contain. Uncertain of something less definable and more essential. As if the event in the chapel had not simply damaged his reputation, but had disturbed something internal, some long-held conviction about himself that the afternoon had quietly and thoroughly disproved. Maren had not come to Velthorpe Hall to reclaim a marriage. She had understood long before that Tuesday morning, long before the envelope arrived, that the union itself was not something she wanted restored. What she had come to reclaim was something older and more concrete. The Ashby property in Wiltshire, a modest but significant estate that had passed through her family for 4 generations and had been transferred, through a series of legal maneuvers conducted during her absence, into holdings connected to the Cravenshaw estate. It had been done quietly, using a provision that required spousal consent, a consent that Dorian had arranged to appear obtained through documents Maren had never signed. That was the second document inside Mr. Aldrich Fenn's envelope. Not merely the proof of an undissolved marriage, but a formal challenge to the transfer of the Ashby estate, citing fraudulent consent and requesting full restoration of the property to its rightful owner. Maren had spent 18 months building that challenge, gathering records, consulting solicitors in 2 counties, tracing every transaction back to its origin with the patience of someone who understands that the truth does not assemble itself quickly, but, once assembled, is very difficult to argue against. The property was not large by ducal standards. It would not make her wealthy in the way that Dorian's world measured wealth. But it was hers, built by her grandfather, maintained by her father, left to her in a will that had been honored in every particular except this one. And recovering it meant something that went beyond stone walls and acreage. It meant that the 2 years she had spent being erased from a life she had legally belonged to had not, in the end, succeeded. It meant that the man who had tried to quietly delete her had instead handed her, through his own arrogance, every tool she needed to make herself impossible to ignore. She had her property back. She had her name back. She had walked into the most powerful room in his world, and left it having taken nothing that was not already hers. By every measure she had set for herself 2 years ago, standing in that hallway with one bag and nowhere to go, Maren Ashby had won. And yet, 11 days after the chapel, there was a knock at her door. No announcement, no letter sent ahead. No footman dispatched to test the reception. Just a man, not a duke, not a title, not an institution, standing at her threshold in a plain, dark coat, waiting to be admitted or turned away. She had prepared for many things over those 2 years. She had not fully prepared for this. What Dorian says next, and what Maren chooses to do with it, is the part of this story that no one predicted. Stay with us. He came to her lodgings on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the chapel. No announcement, no letter sent ahead, no footman dispatched to test the reception before he committed to the visit. Just Dorian himself, on foot, in a plain dark coat that carried none of the visual authority his position usually assembled around him. The landlady who answered the door recognized him anyway. A man like Dorian Velthorpe did not become unrecognizable simply by removing his crest, but Maren, when informed of his presence in the downstairs sitting room, took her time before descending. She found him standing near the window, not seated, which told her something. Men who sit in other people's spaces while waiting have already decided they belong there. Men who stand near windows are still negotiating with themselves about whether they have the right to be present at all. He turned when she entered, and she saw immediately that he had not rehearsed this the way he rehearsed everything else. His expression was unguarded in a way she had seen only once before, on the morning in that cold stone chapel when he had spoken his vows, and believed, however briefly, that he meant them. He did not open with justification. He did not arrive carrying an explanation dressed as an apology, which was what she had half expected and fully prepared for. He said her name, just her name, the way a person says a word they have been turning over in silence for a very long time, and then told her, without preamble or architecture, that he had not understood what he had done until the room went quiet in that chapel, and he saw in the faces of every person present a reflection of himself that he did not recognize. He said it plainly, without the measured cadence of a man managing an audience. And Maren stood in the doorway of her rented sitting room and listened, because she had not come this far by refusing to hear difficult things. The legal process moved with the steady, unhurried momentum of institutions that do not concern themselves with the emotional weather of the people passing through them. The Ashby estate challenge was heard before a chancery court 6 weeks after the chapel, and the outcome, while not instantaneous, was never genuinely in doubt. The documentation Maren had assembled was thorough, the fraudulent consent was demonstrable, and Dorian's legal team, to the quiet surprise of several observers, offered no serious opposition. He had instructed them not to. That detail moved through the social world in its own quiet way, separate from the larger scandal, noticed mostly by people who understood what it meant for a man of Dorian's standing to decline a legal fight he might conceivably have prolonged. It meant he had chosen not to. It meant that somewhere between the chapel and the courtroom, something in his calculus had shifted in a direction that pure self-interest did not fully explain. People speculated about his motivations with the enthusiasm that idle society reserves for puzzles that involve powerful men behaving unexpectedly. Maren did not speculate. She simply waited for the judgment, and when it came, accepted the restoration of her property with the composure of a woman receiving something that had always been hers. What she had not anticipated was the letter that arrived the week after the judgment, not from a solicitor, not written in legal language, but in Dorian's own hand, on plain paper, without ducal letterhead. It was not long. It did not attempt to cover too much ground, which was how she knew he had written it himself rather than composed it with assistance. It said that he understood he had no claim on her time or her consideration, that he was not writing to request either, that he had spent the past 2 months attempting to understand, honestly, and without the defense of justification, what kind of man invites his legal wife to watch him erase her, and that the answer, when he finally stopped flinching from it, had been more uncomfortable than anything the Chancery Court had required of him. He asked for nothing. He closed with her name, and he did not sign it with his title. Maren read the letter twice on the morning it arrived, then set it on the table beside her tea and went about her day. She walked to the market. She reviewed the initial surveyor's report on the Ashby property, which would require significant work before it was fully habitable again. She wrote 3 letters of her own, to her solicitor, to the estate manager she had engaged, and to an old friend in Bath who had kept her correspondence faithfully through 2 years of uncertain address. She did not think about Dorian's letter while she did these things, or if she did not allow the thinking to interrupt the doing. She returned to it that evening by the fire, when the day had closed itself down to the particular quiet that belongs only to people who have learned to be alone without suffering from it. She read it a 3rd time more slowly, with the careful attention she gave to things that deserved to be understood rather than merely processed. And she found in the reading something she had not expected to find. Not performance, not the elegant management of a man trying to recover a situation, but the unmistakable texture of genuine reckoning. It was imperfect. It was incomplete. It was the writing of a man only partway through understanding something large, not a man who had arrived at the other side of it. But it was real, and Maren had spent enough time surrounded by things that were not real to recognize the difference. She did not write back immediately. She gave herself 3 weeks, not out of cruelty, not as a strategy, but because she had promised herself in the long months of rebuilding that she would never again make a significant decision from a place of reaction. When she finally wrote, her letter was shorter than his. It said that she was not the woman who had walked out of Velthorpe Hall 2 years ago, and that any conversation between them would have to begin from that truth rather than from the wreckage of the one that had already ended. It said that she was not interested in restoration. She was interested, if anything, in something that had never existed between them, something built on ground that neither of them had yet stood on. And it said that if he wanted to find out whether that was possible, he knew where she was. She would not be coming to him, not this time. The Ashby estate was reopened in the spring, quietly, without ceremony, without the kind of social announcement that invites commentary. Maren moved back into the house her grandfather had built with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who understands that reclaiming a space means more than occupying it. She repaired what needed repairing. She restored what could be restored. She let some rooms remain changed because she was not the same person who had last walked those floors, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Dorian came to call for the first time in April on a Tuesday morning, which she noted with the private acknowledgment of someone who notices symmetry without being governed by it. He came without announcement and without his title, just the man at the gate, waiting to be admitted or turned away with equal preparedness for either outcome. Maren admitted him. They walked the grounds in the thin spring light, and spoke with the careful honesty of two people who have already seen the worst of each other and are attempting, with full knowledge of that history, to find out whether anything else is possible. There was no performance between them. There was no audience. There was only the difficult, necessary, remarkably ordinary work of two people deciding, one conversation at a time, whether to begin. What society made of it varied depending on who was telling the story. Some said the Duke of Cravenshaw had redeemed himself through genuine change. Others said Maren Ashby had been foolish to allow him through her gate at all. A smaller number, those who had been in the chapel that October afternoon, who had watched a woman sit in perfect stillness while the room fell apart around her, said something different. They said that whatever happened next, the most significant thing had already occurred. A woman who had been quietly erased had made herself impossible to erase. A man who had built his life on control had been undone not by confrontation or vengeance, but by the simple, devastating act of a woman who had refused to disappear on his terms. The story people told about that wedding changed over the years, as stories do. But the part that never changed, the part no retelling could alter, was this. She had walked into that room knowing exactly what she carried, and she had not needed a single person in it to validate what she already knew about herself. That, in the end, was the only victory that had ever mattered. If Maren's story moved something in you, if you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly erased by someone who believed you would simply disappear, then you already know why stories like this one matter. Here, every episode is built around women who are told they are less, and who prove, without shouting, without begging, without performing their pain for anyone's approval, that they were never less at all. Women who disappeared and came back unrecognizable. Women who were handed the worst possible moment and turned it into the beginning of something no one could take from them. Women who walked into rooms that were not built for them and changed the architecture simply by refusing to leave. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss the moment the room goes quiet and the truth finally walks in, because the next story is already waiting. And it begins, as all the best ones do, with something no one saw coming. Stay with us. The best chapter is always the one they never expected you to write.